I would. So open to page 22. Okay. And again, on page 23, we have the layout of the region of Moriah. Okay, so it's all labeled for you there. And then what I did is I put an aerial photograph taken in 1931 underneath that, so that you could compare the model that we made with the actual topography from a picture. Oh, come on, Rain. Okay, now I'm going to read on page 26 at the top of the first column. This is 2 Chronicles 3:1. Now remember, you can't do archaeology here or you start World War III, right? So, but we can read about the one thing on top of another in the Bible. And it says here, then Solomon began to build the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Arona the Jebusite, the place provided by David. Okay, so do you see here that there's two sites being identified? Where Abraham built the altar is on Mount Moriah, and where David built an altar is on the Arona the Jebusite, the threshing floor. So now if you go back to page, so if you go back to page 22, let's look down at the first column just underneath the region of Moriah. And this is the only other time in the Bible that the name Moriah is found. Okay, so the one we just read in 2 Chronicles 3:1 and Genesis 22. And it says this, then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Okay, so this is this mountain, Mount Moriah, that then 2 Chronicles is talking about, where Solomon built the temple. Then if you go to the next page, in the first column, page 24, first column, it says, I'm just going to go down, I'm not going to read the entire story. Well, maybe we'll go back and read it, but I just want to get the point across. About middle of that there, it says that he, that is Abraham, went over and took the ram that was caught in the thicket and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son Isaac. And this is where we're talking about the substitutionary sacrifice, okay, which was established from the first story that we read in Genesis 22 about this place. Abraham was instructed to go to this specific place, build an altar, put his son Isaac on it, whom he loved, go to sacrifice him. He went to sacrifice him. The Lord stopped him and provided instead a ram caught in the thickets. He took the ram out and sacrificed the ram in place of his son. How was Isaac saved? He was saved by the substitutionary sacrifice of the ram. And that sets the theme then for what this mountain is about from then on. Okay, now if we go over to David's altar in the next column over, I'm just going to read a few portions of that. So if you'll remember, a plague broke out on Jerusalem and Israel because David was counting his military fighters. And it says, and he's instructed right in the middle of that quote, it says, on that day Gad went to David and said to him, go up and build an altar to Yahweh on the threshing floor of Arona the Jebusite. Okay? And then if you skip down a sentence, it says, David built an altar to Yahweh there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then Yahweh answered his prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. So the plague was killing the people of Jerusalem and Israel. How was it stopped? David went up on the same mountain and built an altar where his forefather 1,000 years earlier had built an altar and sacrificed these animals in place of Israel and Jerusalem, which then stopped the plague on the people. Okay, and then we come and you see a threshing floor there. That's what a threshing floor looks like, a picture of it from the 1800s, and that's where you want to put it. If you live in Jebus down here or the city of David, you want your threshing floor up there on the hill so that when you're throwing your wheat up into the air, it's blowing the chaff. You want a place that's exposed to the wind. Okay, so a threshing floor is very symbolic for where this altar is and for substitutionary sacrifice, because a threshing floor is a place where you separate the grain, which is valuable, that goes into the barn, from the chaff that is not valuable, that you burn up with fire, right? And that what is the separation is what we're talking about, is what separates. Forgiveness of sin. Okay, now that's the temple then that Solomon built, that's then destroyed by the Babylonians. And now let's look at page 27, the first column. This is Zerubbabel's temple. And let me just read the last verse of that first quote out of Ezra. It says this, it says, "Let the governor of the Jews," that is Zerubbabel, "and the Jewish elders," now listen to this, "rebuild the house of God on its site." On its original site. Look at the next quote right underneath that from Ezra 9:9. "He," that is Cyrus, "has granted us new life to rebuild the house of God and repair its" what? Ruins. So the people not only returned, the group not only returned from their exile, their Babylonian exile, they not only returned to Jerusalem, but more specifically, they returned to the ruins of the temple, of the first temple, and rebuilt the second temple on the ruins of the first one. Are you seeing from these verses one thing on top of another?
Yeah.
Abraham's altar, David's altar, Solomon's temple, and now Zerubbabel's temple. Then listen to this Josephus quote for what Herod then did. This is the first quote on the right column of page 27. So Josephus says, "In the 18th year of his reign, Herod started to enlarge and reconstruct the temple at his own expense, which he knew would be his greatest enterprise." So of all the things that you've seen of Herod the Great and what he was doing, the one he considered the most important and his greatest was the expansion and glorification of Zerubbabel's temple. Okay, he didn't move. Sometimes you're going to hear that these days that these temples are in different places. They're not in different places. They're in the same place. And so he just made the temple that Zerubbabel had rebuilt. Remember, the people were mourning because some of them had seen Solomon's temple, and the glory of Zerubbabel's temple did not compare to Solomon's temple. And so Herod tried to fix that and make the glory of the second temple greater. Yeah.
Did David and Abraham build their altars on the rock or somewhere else up there? When they built,
now?
David and Abraham, when they built their altars, did they do it on the rock or built it on top of the rock, or did they build it somewhere else up there?
Well, the only indication that we have is we know generally where the second temple altar was because of the orientation of where the Holy of Holies was, which is where the Dome of the Rock is.
Yeah.
So yeah, Abraham built an altar, David built an altar, then Solomon built an altar because it was the altar for the temple,
Right.
and then it was rebuilt. So we have the same place on top of another. So it's never been excavated. Who
So
knows
we don't know
exactly?
if it's on the rock or somewhere else there.
Right. Well, it wouldn't be on the
Out
rock.
in front of the rock.
rock was where
the picture showed it like separate here.
Right. Okay, now let's read on page 27 that under Roman destruction on that right column down at the bottom, out of Matthew 24, 1 through 2. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Okay, so now we're talking about the 70 AD destruction when that was fulfilled. And now there's no temple from that time, 70 AD, until today. There's no Jewish temple up there. Okay, now Hadrian comes along in 130 AD, so we're talking just about 100 years later. No, less than that. From 70 AD to 130, about 60 years later, he comes to the rubble, and he's going to rebuild it. Go over to page 30, and we have this quote from Jerome. Everybody knows who Jerome is. He's the one who did the Vulgate. In Latin, he lived here. He's an eyewitness to this. He saw this with his own eyes, and this is his quote on page 30, down at the bottom of the first paragraph. He described what he saw on the Temple Mount. Here's his quote: "Where once were the temple and the religion of God, there a statue of Hadrian and an idol of Jupiter are set up together." Okay, so if you turn back to the page before, you'll see that depiction in the model. You'll see two statues up on either side of the rock, and exactly what that shrine up there looked like, who knows, but we know from that description that it had the two statues of Hadrian and Jupiter, which, by the way, are the two gods, little g, that the city then is named after. Aelia is one of Hadrian's names, and Capitolina after Jupiter. Okay, so it's supplanted by him, and then during the Byzantine period, that shrine to the Caesars is wiped out, and then we have this quote over on page 31. And this is our historical source to know what happened and how we got the Dome of the Rock there. So let's read it. "Then Omar said to him," and this is the Byzantine bishop of Jerusalem at the time, he says, "You owe me a rightful debt." He's just taken Jerusalem, Omar has, but he didn't destroy Jerusalem. The city surrendered to him, and he says, "You owe me a rightful debt. Give me a place in which I might build a sanctuary." The patriarch said to him, "It is the rock." What is the rock? Top of Mount Moriah. "It is in the center of the world and was a temple for the Israelites, who held it in great veneration, and wherever they were, they turned their faces towards it during prayer." Okay, now, listen to this. The Byzantines, however, the Christians, however, neglected it and did not hold it in veneration, nor did they build a church over it, which is unusual, isn't it? Because we've seen so many churches. Why? Why didn't they build a church over it? Because Christ our Lord said in his holy gospel, "Not a stone will be left upon a stone, which will not be ruined and devastated." For this reason, the Christians left it as a ruin and did not build a church over it. Okay, so that's why to the left there on page 30, you see in the model, and also in the model that's an actual model here in Jerusalem that I took a picture of, the Temple Mount in the Byzantine period is bare. Nothing there. Now, look on page 31, and this is what we've read all of this to get. Here's our layer system for this site, okay? Starting with the oldest, down at the bottom of the page, layer 1 is Abraham's altar, then David's altar, then Solomon's temple, destroyed by the Babylonians, rebuilt in the Persian period, Zerubbabel's temple, expanded in the Roman period by Herod's temple. Then we get Hadrian's shrine, then we have it lay completely bare, and then we have this Islamic shrine that we just read about, the quote that Omar chose the place, and then a later caliph is the one that actually built the Dome of the Rock that was dedicated in 692 AD. And those are our layers. See that? One thing on top of another. Now, we can see evidence for all of these even without excavating. And so if you're wondering how, just turn the page. There's the rock. You see the rock pictured there? That's the rock underneath the dome of the rock, right? Everybody see that?
Right.
That's the oldest thing you could see if we were able to go into the dome of the rock, which we weren't. Then that would be the oldest thing that we would see. Is because it's the peak of the mountain, right? That peak was there when Abraham went up there and built an altar. You can also see to the right there, that's Hadrian's arch that he reconstructed there to lead up onto where he had his shrine with the statue of himself. We have the fallen stones, which we're going to see in a little bit. It's one of my favorite pictures that I've taken is this young Jewish youth that is on the day of mourning. This is the day of mourning for the destruction of the temple, sitting in the rubble of the destruction in mourning. Next side is you see the western wall, only you see it during a feast time when it's crowded. Hopefully it won't be that crowded today. And so you see those are the stones of Herod the Great. We talked about the seam that's underneath it. That takes us back before Herod the Great to masonry from Zerubbabel's temple. And then we've looked at everything that surrounds it. We see the Solomonic walls, even though we can't excavate there, we see the Solomonic walls that are the evidence that Solomon did indeed expand the city to the north and take in the city. We've seen that Salem down there is occupied in the time of Abraham. And so you see the evidence around and even in the walls of that surround Mount Moriah. So think of a mountain, right, with a peak. If you're going to build a building up on top of it, you got to build these big, massive stone walls around it and then fill it in with rubble and dirt so that flatten it out so that you can build your buildings up on top of it. So even without digging, we have all this evidence, and I point that out in with these red arrows. Now, go to page 39, first column, under interpretation. I'm going to read Mark 15:37 through 39. It says, "With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, 'Surely this man was the Son of God.'" Okay? So, the point is Jesus didn't die at this place. We might expect that he would have died at the same place that all these altars and temples where animals were sacrificed. Think about how many animals were sacrificed during the whole first temple period and second temple period. Right? We're talking tons of blood. We might think that Jesus would die right there. But Hebrews tells us that he died outside the gate of the city. But when he died, it affected a single place in the city. Where was that? Right there. And that's the tearing of the temple. And we see what that symbolizes by the centurion standing under the cross of Jesus, whom God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, just as he asked Abraham to do with Isaac to foreshadow what God would do himself. The centurion standing underneath Jesus' cross, when Jesus breathed his last and the curtain ripped in two, we see what that means in the centurion who says, surely this man was the Son of God. In other words, he enters in through the curtain. See what I'm talking about? And so again, we see a centurion. We've seen a lot of centurions along our way. Cornelius in Joppa, or in Caesarea. We've seen him at Capernaum, the centurion who had such great faith. And now we see the centurion who is the first to enter into that ripped open curtain, into relationship with God through the sacrifice of his Son Jesus for the forgiveness of sins.
Amen.
Let me see, where is that? Wait. So go to page 40. So I'm going to read Luke 4:9 through 13 because I want you to understand this also happened up where we're going to be looking. The devil led him, that is Jesus, to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. So the highest point of the temple would have been the Holy of Holies, which is directly over the rock. If you are the Son of God, now listen to what he says to him. There's Satan and Jesus standing next to each other in the spirit, I believe, right? Standing next to each other. And what does Jesus say to him? Or what does Satan say to Jesus? If you be the Son of God. What did the centurion believe at the foot of the cross as the curtain ripped? Surely he was the Son of God. Now, what does the dedicatory inscription say? If you go to page 37, this is what it says over there on the right side next to the inscription, dating to 692. This dedicatory inscription is also found in the Quran and reads, "So believe in God and all the messengers, and stop talking about a Trinity. Say only the truth about Jesus, over whom you dispute. He is the Son of Mary." Now listen to this. "It is not fitting that God should beget or father a son." Okay, now I want you to look down at the Dome of the Rock on top of the Temple Mount. Since 692 AD, that Dome of the Rock has said Jesus is not the Son of God. You think that's a coincidence? So do you think that's a coincidence? That for what, the last 1,300 years, the dedication inscription has declared that Jesus is not the Son of God at the very place that Satan stood next to Jesus and said, "If you be the Son of God, throw yourself down." The very place where the curtain was ripped open when the centurion believed surely he was the Son of God. It's all about Jesus being who he claims to be as the Son of God. That's salvation. If he's not the Son of God, he's not the perfect sacrifice for sin, and we're still in our sin. And so, again, this is the reality of history and archaeology and theology. That's what this place you're about to go up on is. Now, it's not going to look like all of this. Almost everything that you see is from the Islamic period, because it's an Islamic shrine that's up there today, and a mosque. Okay, so we're not going to see Abraham's altar or David's altar or anything from the temples or anything like that. But just, I want you to understand what a profound place we're about to go up on. Now think about this. This is the Temple Mount in a Jewish state, and we are not allowed to take Bibles up on this place. And we are not allowed to pray up here. If you pray up here, you get arrested.
Keep that in mind.
Well, but just think of that. Why? Why? It's because of everything we just went through. Makes it the sensitive place on earth. If you could think of all the religiosity of the world and put it in a tornado, it would touch down right here, right on earth. Okay, so we got our teaching in. Now let's put our books away, and then we're